Hi, everybody. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library, for any of you who don't know me. And tonight I'm going to talk about military records. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is an overview. This is not everything you need to know about every record any military's ever generated. It's very much a case of me showing you some of what's out there and the sorts of things you can find from military records and some beginning guidance on how to find where these records are. Does that make sense? There's no way in the next 45 minutes I can cover the entire scope of military records. But I'm hoping that you go out of this with enough to say, that might be worth tracking down, and I have an idea of where to start. Various militaries over the years have generated lots and lots of records. I'm going to show you very briefly. This is one record set. This is now online, but 10 years ago, I had to write away for it and wait for it to come from England. This is 17 pages, ledger-sized pages, from the National Archives in London for a private, tracing his entire military career. It tells me when he enlisted, everywhere he went for the British Army, which included the Caribbean and parts of Canada. Tells me that he retired to Peebles in southern Scotland, which is why I knew he existed. He's listed a couple years after he retires in a household as a half-brother to the head of the household. I have not found how he's connected to the family, other than he's listed as a half-brother. But whether it's to the head of the household or the wife or anything like that, I found nothing further. But at least I have his military record. So anyhow, and that's just one record. That's a record for one very minor cog in the military. So it's 17 pages on one private. So the military tended to keep pretty good records. The question is, how do you get your hands on them? So let me start the PowerPoint. Let's start the slideshow. And let me share my screen so you can see it as well. You guys should now have the PowerPoint. Okay. And I'm going to stop my video if I can, so that you don't have to look at where is it? Okay, you don't have to look at the side of my head as I look at my second screen. So, military records. A couple days ago, there was a thing going around Twitter about writing a horror story in 6 words or less. And I said, I don't need 6 words. I'm a genealogist. I can do it in 3 numbers: 1890, 1922, and 1973. Well, as I'm sure most of you are aware, 1890 is the US Census. It's no longer available because it's gone. 1922 is the year that many Irish records burned in the Irish Civil War, making Irish genealogy much harder than it has to be, or it could have been. In 1973, there was a fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, which destroyed approximately 16 to 18 million military personnel records, meaning that a huge percentage, somewhere around the 80% of the Army service records of people personnel discharged from 1912 to 1960 are gone or close to it. And the Air Force records the Air Force didn't start until the end of the World War I. It had been the Army's, part of the Army before that. And so if you write for one of these records, they will sometimes, if there's stuff they can recreate, they will. But when you combine this fire with privacy laws, basically, I don't want to tell you that World War II and later is impossible to find information on, but it can be difficult just because you have privacy laws that have various levels of when you can get a hold of something. So for example, most Vietnam era records are still under a privacy hold where you can't get anything from them. And then the two world wars and Korea, many of those records burned for personnel. But there are still records out there. I am going to do in this, I'm going to talk briefly about not only US records, but I'm going to show you some Canadian and some English records, just so you can see the sorts of things armies generated and the type of things to go looking for. So, as with most things, two really good places to start. Yeah, the Navy records didn't burn, but they have some privacy issues about what they can and cannot release. And they were considerably less of a percentage. Most people went into the Army, although for World War II, the Navy was much bigger a percentage, but for World War I, you're really mostly looking at Army records. You know, the percentage, my understanding is the percentage of people in the Navy was relatively small for World War I. But you know, I'm not a military historian, so I don't know those details off the top of my head, but some of this will become clear as I talk more. You know, I talk frequently about the Family Search Wiki and Cindy's List as being places to start. I would highly recommend, Cindy's List is great, but the Family Search Wiki, particularly for a topic like this that's kind of overwhelming, the Family Search Wiki is going to be your good place to start. And I'll show you some samples from that in a little bit. The other thing to know for US military records, the National Archives, sometimes abbreviated as NARA, for the National Archives and Record Administration, and state archives are going to, in some cases, have these records. For example, if you have an ancestor who fought for the Confederacy, that person's pension records will be with the state that he was in the military for. Because there was no Confederacy after the war, so it was the southern states were doing pensions for the Confederate military. So NARA does have a lot about what they have and how to find it. They don't have many records online on their own. They've tended to work with partners like Family Search or Ancestry to get them online. One of the other things to note is that Ancestry owns Fold 3, and a lot of their, it's not as dramatic as with the newspapers being shuffled over to newspapers.com, but there are things that they've put at Fold 3, which is an additional subscription. Fold 3 does 3 or 4 times a year run a free weekend. Like they did a free weekend this weekend because of Memorial Day. They usually do it around Veterans Day and a couple others. They'll do a free weekend or free week. And they also do a free week trial, and you can get you can buy a 1-month subscription. So, you know, if you're at the point where you're really looking at a lot of military records and you're getting sent there from Ancestry or Family Search a fair bit, it may be worth doing a 1-month subscription. So So basically, when you're looking at somebody's military files, you're going to tend to you get draft records, you get service records, and you get pension records. So essentially, the draft records are what happens up till the point they enlist. Service records is when they're active, and pension records are after they've left the service. Does that make sense? Everybody get that? Okay. So let's look at draft records first, because they're the first part of the military file. I will say you're going to tend to get the most genealogically relevant information out of either draft records or pension records. You won't get much usually out of the service record. So the draft records, here we have, this is a Civil War draft. This is for the state of Massachusetts. It's done by congressional district. So this is the 5th congressional district. You'll notice this page happens to be, it's not really alphabetized, but it's everybody whose name starts with L in Beverly or in Danvers, who is the right age to serve in the Civil War and who's not already enlisted. So they give you the person's name, their age, white or colored, profession, whether they're married, where they were born. If there was former military service, you're going to get very few men at this point with former service, just because you did not have that big a standing army in peacetime. And then remarks. So this first person, they say, is subject to fits, which probably means he has epilepsy or something like that. So I'm guessing they didn't draft him. This man was born in Ireland, and so it says he has his first papers. Through a lot of these wars, especially from the Civil War to World War I, fighting in the military was a fast track to getting citizenship. It's not at all unusual for somebody to serve in the military for a year and they get their citizenship. So this was the way Massachusetts did the Civil War draft. And they tell you subject to between the ages of 20 and 35, and also unmarried persons from 35 to 45. So that tells you who they would be looking for. So here's one for World War I. And the reason I pulled this one out is that this is a man living in Maine, Paul Napoleon Baudouin, living in Gardner, Maine, gives his exact birth date. He's still an alien, has not filed for citizenship. It gives his exact birthplace, Warwick, Quebec, Canada, which for this time and place, this may be the only record you find of his birthplace. Because it may just, if it just says Quebec on it may just say Quebec on any naturalization papers, but here it actually gives the town and the exact date. And you'll notice that he was from Canada, but at this point, Canada did not have separate citizenship from the UK. So he's listed as a Canadian citizen. This is at Ancestry. All of these World War I draft registrations are at Ancestry. And a lot of, I think they're at Family Search as well. He's working in Gardner. He has a child who's 7. He's single, and exemption from the draft, he's claiming since he's this child's only caretaker. And then you actually have his signature. So this, you can see why this is one of those papers that if you were looking for him, there's probably, because it's a land crossing, there may not be a record of him crossing the border into the US, because they did not necessarily keep great records of people crossing by train or whatever over the border. So the fact that this does have his exact birth date and birthplace is really helpful. If, you know, if he happens to be the ancestor you're looking for. Here's my great-grandfather. This is nice because he gives his full name and information, where he's working, and for nearest relative, he names his wife, including giving her maiden name. Not everybody did that, but he did. You know, he's a citizen, and so on. But, you know, if he hadn't been, it would have told you whether he'd already started the process or hadn't started the process in terms of citizenship. And you'll notice here it says native born, naturalized, or citizen by father's naturalization before the person's majority. So you'd be able to tell whether they were naturalized on their own or because their father had been naturalized when they were younger than 21. Which again, for tracking down future other records about this family, could be very helpful, that distinction. Now here's World War II, that same Roger Poor, living at the same place. You'll notice here he says Mrs. Roger A. Poor, which doesn't help much if you don't know what her name is. This is actually called, so for World War I, let's go back to this, they were in 1917 and 18, any man born between 1875 and 1900 living in the US and not already in the military was supposed to register for the draft. Citizenship did not matter. If you lived in the United States and you were a male born in that range of years from 1875 to 1900, you were supposed to register. And, you know, when I talked about, you know, 1890 and the how awful it is to not have that census, one of the ways to work around some of that is to find draft cards for these men, because sometimes you will get information like here he's you know, I already knew about him because, you know, he's pretty well I've been able to document him on other sources. But let's say I didn't have, he was living in a state that hadn't yet started marriage records. This would be a really good clue as to who his wife was if I didn't have another source for that. So that's one reason I'm a big fan of the World War I cards. Then with World War II, they did what's called an old man's draft. And these are basically the same men who did that draft for World War I. This is from 1877 to 1897 for the birth year. Because what was happening is, you know, the war is dragging on at this point. It's 1942. And so they're beginning, the military is beginning to figure if we need more men, you know, we'll draft these men in their 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and make them into clerks and cooks and truck drivers, and have the younger men be cannon fodder. Yeah, the 1890 census is gone. It burned. Although my understanding is a lot of the problem was actually water damage, and if it happened now, they would have been able to recreate it. But, you know, when it happened, they couldn't. The veteran supplement is still in existence, which I'm not going to talk about much here, but it is a very handy way. It is very handy to have. So these are, I picked this because I knew that Roger Poor was going to be in both of these. So it's very similar. He's living at the same address even. He had changed jobs, but he was at the same address. And I can tell you that they were at that same address up until he died in 1970. This is his son, and I pulled this one out because it's interesting. So here you have Roger Harvey Poor giving the address in Salem, but if you look here, he's up at Colby College here in Maine and registers there in Waterville, as you can see here. But they send his card down to Salem because that's his official address. But when I looked at the record, you know, the search results at Ancestry, this showed up as Waterville rather than Salem, and I knew that was going to be him because I knew he'd gone to Colby. So if you see somebody who looks almost right, pull up the card and see if there's something like this going on, where, you know, he was a young man who'd gone off to work somewhere or go to college and registered there, but they ended up sending it back to his permanent address. Oops, I went the wrong way. So here's another case. This is World War II. And this first one, oh, come on, B. These are my dad's two older brothers. And I pulled these because I knew of a little quirk here. So my dad's oldest brother says he's living at 122 Resch in Buffalo, gives his birth date, gives his father as the his closest contact. Again, at 122 Resch. Then his brother gives the same address, says Margaret Jameson, which is nice to have the mother's name, and says 172 Resch. And so I'm like, so I know enough to know that this should have been 122. But what's nice is these are the two brothers. Well, the father hit the old man's draft. And so here's my grandfather also giving 122 Resch Avenue. Margaret Jameson is his wife, confirming that, and giving the same address for her. So I can be pretty sure that this 172 is a typo and not that he was living down the street from his mother. But again, you get the case of the sons are in the regular draft and the father's in the old man's draft for World War II. So it's worth knowing what that difference is. For a long time at Ancestry, they only had the old man's draft, and they've only in the last 6 to 8 weeks have gotten the regular young men's draft cards up. But they are there now, so that's helpful. Again, this is my other grandfather. Interesting story here. By the time he registers here, he gives his father's address, and his father is his next of kin. He's actually newly married to his second wife. They're expecting her second, his third child. But he doesn't give the second wife. He gives his dad's address, even though he was living with the second wife at this point. They evidently were temporarily in Connecticut. And then even later, you get this along the side where he's moved to North Carolina. Now this is Charlotte. They end up in Raleigh a couple years later and live there until he dies. But they did try to keep track of if a man moved. So that can be another interesting hint to things happening in the family's life at this point. So service records. There are different ways these come up. This is an interesting case. In the Civil War, the Union decided to have units that were completely African American, except that they decided that these African American units had to have white officers. And so what the Army did is they recruited officers from mostly Massachusetts abolitionist families. So this John Waterman, even though he's in the US Colored Troops, 1st Cavalry, was as white as could be. And you can see here, and so if you find a Civil War file, a lot of them are just a series of these cards. And so here you have, he was on the muster out roll in Norfolk. He'd been promoted to 1st lieutenant in the same regiment, gives various other information. Here's another card of his, you know, where they changed, where he was assigned from one command to another so that you're tracking him through. But as you can see, these don't tend to have much they're fascinating, and they really help you put together this soldier's career, but the service records don't have that much of a genealogical information set. Here's one, this is the same, he's down here, this John Waterman. In addition to the cards on the individuals, periodically each base had to send in a list of who was there. And so they start with the majors and stuff up, you know, the generals and then the majors, and you work your way down to the lieutenants and then various others. And so you can, again, track what he's doing. And so, you know, it'll say in charge of recruits, in charge of unassigned recruits, you know, this person was the quartermaster and so on. This is a British Army World War I signing up. This is James Jameson, great uncle of mine, living in Leith. It tells you he'd been a bottle merchant. He'd actually served before, which is a little unusual again at this point. But again, you get the signature. And this is the beginning. If you look at a British service papers, this is the beginning of it. And then this is the next one, and you can see his age, little, you know, he's 5'3½". Next of kin is his wife, lists his wife and kids. And then down here, it shows, you know, where he was sent and, you know, which regiment he was in. He was in the Royal Scots. So you get posted to one place, posted missing, and then killed in action. And then there's another 10 pages of where he'd been moved around, how he'd been paid, all of that, with nothing other than that type of very Army-specific information. And if you think this one, this is the UK, this is Canada. Yes, they look a lot alike. Canada was still pretty much British at this point. And so this is my grandfather, James's brother, giving the same, oops, sorry about that, same information. And again, you get his signature here. And yes, he's the one that, you know, by World War II is living in Buffalo and has the 2 sons registering for the draft. And again, you know, there's, after this page, it's only details about his military career, nothing that's of help genealogically. Although this is interesting, at the end of the war, especially for men who'd been injured, so they weren't sending them home just in a huge group, they often contracted, the Canadian military contracted with civilian carriers to take men home instead of doing Army transport. And so here he is down here going back to Toronto after the war. So that's helpful to know when he arrived back, and that he's in a list of people who've been injured. And so I can go looking to see if there is then in his file, there is information about the injury. So pension records are the other thing that gets you a lot of information genealogically. Here's one, and I know you can't read it, but it's a letter from the mother of a man killed in the Civil War saying, you know, he was my support and I need help with a pension because he's no longer here to help me on the farm. And then you get here that, you know, the confirmation that he had served and had been injured in the war. Actually, he had died right before a battle at Petersburg, Virginia. He had actually died of typhus, not of war injuries. You also get minors. These are cases where the children of somebody have said, my father died in the service, I'm eligible for a pension. Here's an interesting one. This is the widow applying for a pension. She's remarried, so she was Susan Jones. Her last name's now Tricky. She's living in Bangor. Her husband was Elisha Jones, who's a captain in Company C in the 2nd Maine. And then I had to split this, and this actually goes down below this recognized attorney. But here you get the approvals of the pension, and then you get the important dates. The date the man enlisted, died in service, date he died, the date they married, which, you know, when you think about in Maine, this may be the only record of that marriage date because Maine did not keep good records until the 1890s. And then she did remarry. But this is one reason, looking at these pension records, they often had to prove that marriage somehow. If somebody was killed in action, there may well be a will or other information about it. This is James Jamison, killed the first day of the Somme, along with something like 60,000 other service members. So even though he died in France, his will was proved in Scotland, and his uncle was the executor. And it gives you the information about that. Here's his actual, this is the sending the effects he had, again, to the uncle John Adam, and how much, what they sent from what he had on his person when he died. And here's the killed in action card with the children, information that the widow did remarry, what they paid him at various points, and information about what unit he was in, which again can help you track back because a lot of times records are listed by a unit or a regiment or a battalion and not just strictly alphabetical. So you may well, whether it's US, Canadian, or UK service, you will also almost always need to know what company or regiment they were in. So some other records that come up. The Maine State Archives has some, especially for the Civil War. This is a summary of what's been digitized. There's a lot more that hasn't been yet. And you would have to look at the archives website and see, or send them an email and say, you know, I'm looking for X for somebody who served in Maine. Do you have it? And you know, through the 19th century, there's going to be a lot that's done at the state level. A lot's also done at the federal level, but a lot of these, a lot of the information, especially for the Civil War, is going to be in Augusta rather than in DC. Other places you can go to look. I'll show you the DAR website. A lot of the SAR applications for Revolutionary War service descendants, the SAR applications are at Ancestry. The DAR has their own website, and I'll show you that in a minute. Same thing, 1840 census generally only lists the head of the household unless there's a veteran, and I'll show you that. Revolutionary War Loyalist records are spread around, and there were sort of two waves of Loyalists. There were those who went early out of great conviction, and then there's a second wave after the war's over of people who wanted, in many cases, wanted the free land as much as they wanted to be Loyalists. And then regimental museums, these are more, these are a bigger issue in the UK than in the US, but even in the US, you will get museums dedicated to a particular unit. But certainly, you know, in the UK, you know, the Royal Scots and the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Royal Cameron Highlanders and such all have their own little museums, often at the barracks that is their headquarters, but not always. One way to tell if somebody was a veteran in some cases is the gravestone. You'll see right here, it lists right on the stone that he served in World War II. In many cases, the military actually pays for the stone. You know, I don't know the details on that, but I do know that they will. I've seen vouchers for them paying for the military paying for a stone. And you'll even get this where you have this stone that was done in 1818, and then sometime later, this is a DAR, SAR, some other type of thing coming through, probably a good 100 years later, and putting this down. Sometimes you'll see, if you get, and I don't have a good picture of this, but instead of a flag, or next to a flag, you'll also get a little circular medallion that says GAR for Grand Army of the Republic, which would be a case of, that means you should look for more, you should look for Union Army service. That's what the Grand Army of the Republic was. There are others that have, there are other medallions you'll find. I don't know most of them off the top of my head, but I know the MOCA, the Maine Old Cemetery Association guide, has a list of them, some of them, and a lot of them you can find by Googling. You know, if you did GAR tomb medallion, it would come up that it's the Grand Army of the Republic. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And so any questions at this point before I go and show you some real live websites?
Do you have any more advice for finding Loyalist records?
I'll talk about that momentarily.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. They're kind of tricky, like a lot of these, they're not in one place.
Right.
You know, you would think on one hand that military records would be all in one place, you know, but they're not. So any other questions so far on what I've said? Okay, let me share my screen again so I can walk you through. So as I said, one of the best places to start is the Family Search Wiki. And actually, let me do this. If you go to the Family Search Wiki, which is here, and then I click North America, and then United States, and then down to, where are they? Military records. This has been well built out. This is a crowdsourced wiki, but at the same time, you get beginning information, you get a summary of some of the biggest online sources of stuff, overview of what's at the National Archives, what's in DC, what's at the National Personal Records Center at St. Louis, what the American Legion holds, some information on, is that the right one? I think it is. Like what the National Park Service has. So this should be your first stop. And then in addition to all of that, you'll see here, they go through each war and then some of the record types, like pension records or prisoner of war records. Okay.
Yeah.
It might help with Alicia, huh?
Yeah, right.
So does that make sense? Why this should be your starting point?
Yes.
And then when I went into the pension records, again, you can see this is pretty well built out in terms of, here's Confederate pensions, and they list all of the states where you would contact the state where the veteran lived after the war, and here's a link to who got a pension and who has the records. And again, you can go by conflict, and so on. So that's why I really suggest, before you really dig into military records, and quite frankly, with most types of records, it's worth reading through the Family Search Wiki before you really dig into them. So let me show you. This is a pension record. It's an application for a bounty land, because after the Revolution and after War of 1812, a lot of these states along the East Coast were land rich and cash poor, and so it was easier to give out land to somebody than it was to give money. And think about it, if you were a healthy 28-year-old man, you were better off being given a farm than being given a few dollars a month as a pension. You'd make more in the long run, plus the pension often died with you, whereas the land was yours and you could give it to your children. Does that make sense? In a way, it was a better deal for everybody. The state didn't have the cash, and so they were able to, but they had land, so they gave the land away. So if you're wondering what the Western Reserve in Ohio is, that was land that Connecticut claimed as its Western Reserve. And so most of the early settlers up in the Cleveland, Akron area were veterans of one of either the Revolution or the War of 1812, claiming land in that area. Let's see what else. So yes, there are payment ledgers at Family Search, and here's a sample of one of them. Oop, I signed in earlier. I guess it logged me out. And if you go in, it shows you how they were, you can see when, this is for Concord, New Hampshire, it's invalid pensions, and you can see how much was paid out and when they started, and so on. So, they, as many of you have heard me say, money leads to records. People were being given money, so there were records that this generated. So that's that. Okay, so here we have, this is, let me go back a page. Come on. This is the 1840 census. And this is for the towns of Norway and Greenwood. Greenwood is the home of LL Bean. And this is just like all of the census up to 1840. It's a bunch of check marks. But what there is on the back of that page, and most people, they know that there are check marks, and so they stop there. Well, if you go to the next page, it's the back of this one. And we have information of persons employed in each, manufacturing and agriculture. And then let me blow this up so you can see it. This column is pensioners for revolutionary or military services included in the foregoing. So in this household, which was the fifth one down, so we go back, and the fifth one down is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Edmund Morrill, he's got a man named Isaac Turner living with him who's 87 years old. So it gives the name and the exact age of the person who is getting the pension from the revolution. And it's not only men. Here we have a Margaret Cushman and a Mary Needham. So if you're looking at the 1840 census, be sure to check that second page to see if there's someone in the household who is a Revolutionary War pensioner. Oh, yeah. And there are multiple places, including this New Horizons website, where people have extracted this information. And so here it is for Oxford County, Maine, and you have the person's name and their age and then the household they're in. And he's done it for almost all of the states. But you don't necessarily need to do that. Although these people will not always come up in a search. So if you search that Mary Needham, she might or might not come up. I've had it happen both ways. And then again, NARA has large, this is the, when you go into search our records and military records, you can see they've just got, they have got a lot of specific information on all the different types of records you'll find through them. So you'll be in pretty good shape if you look both at NARA and at the Family Search Wiki for the war you're interested in, that your ancestor or relative might have served in. Let me show you Oh, I showed you the colored troops. The National Park Service for the Civil War has a soldiers and sailors database, which you can find by doing National Park Service Civil War soldiers database in Google. And they give you regimental histories, they give you information about some of the soldiers, the battles. Many of these cemeteries are linked to a National Park Service site, monuments, and so on. So they've got, this is aimed at tourists to some extent. It's aimed at people going to visit the battlefields and so on. But they have a lot of good information and a lot of pictures. So that's worth knowing about. The Maine State Archives has a lot for Maine. If we go into the Civil War, there is some correspondence. They have a lot of portraits of people. So you can search, if you have somebody who was from Maine, who served in the Civil War, they've tried to collect all the portraits they can of those men. So again, if you're doing, those of you doing find a grave stuff, if you find somebody who served for the Union and you want to see if you can find a picture of them, the state archives may have it. But they also have like a lot of the general orders that were given. You can go in and see what they were. And if you want to, you can download a full-sized copy. Some of these aren't that built out yet. They're still working on getting stuff digitized and up, but it's getting there. They've got hospital information. They've got a lot of Joshua Chamberlain's correspondence, several other diaries and correspondence. So it's worth, like, let's say Dexter True is not your ancestor, but your ancestor was also in the 2nd Maine Cavalry. It may be worth reading through that to see if your ancestors mentioned, and if not, just to sort of get a general feel of what they went through. So don't forget the state archives for Maine or Massachusetts, depending where your ancestor was. So going further back to the Revolution, this is the DAR website. And it's not that hard to negotiate once you realize that GRS stands for Genealogical Research System. And then here, if you want to find an ancestor, you have to click on Ancestor. And I'm going to put in a last name. And state of service is Massachusetts. And search. And there were 21 that they've got listed. And so let's click here on Zadok. And it's saying he's got wife Abigail Barry. And then here it tells you supporting documents are available and their descendants. And you can then buy a the definitive what they've got. But here, these are descendants in their lines, and it's a way to get started on if somebody was a Revolutionary War soldier. There's also a book series called Soldiers and Sailors of Massachusetts in the Revolutionary War, something like that. It's like 12 or 14 volumes. And a lot of libraries here in Maine have it because remember, at the time of the Revolution, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So that's worth knowing that you can find that. Loyalist stuff. Again, Family Search Wiki, those of you who are asking. These are the primary links. They've got some at my memory is the Library and Archives Canada has a really good summary. This is more in the Family Search Wiki. So if you go to the Family Search Wiki and put Loyalist in the here, let me show you if my computer will cooperate. When you're at the home page, if you put Loyalist here in the topic, it'll come up with what I was just showing you. And this, these are the primary links you'll want to look at. Yeah, I'm not going to go in much more detail, but for those of you who, like me, do have a couple Loyalist lines, which is not unusual for those of us who have ancestors in northern New England, because people left, went to Canada, and then migrated back at some point. And there was free land available at points, so that was in the 1790s. So there was free and cheap land. So that's certainly an incentive for some people who didn't care that much one way or the other to go to Canada. And then, as I said, regimental museums, King's Own Scottish Borderers. You can see they've got this really nice website with the museum, the history of the regiment, the museum. So some of the campaigns they research, family history inquiries, and so on. And most of the British regiments have that kind of website and museum. So, and a lot of the Canadian ones do as well. But it's a really big thing in the UK and Ireland. So if you have ancestors who served in the military in the UK or Ireland, it's worth finding the regimental museum. So let me stop sharing. Any other questions at this point? It's a lot of material. Yeah, I had to really cut down. I was hoping to get it done in 50 minutes. It took me an hour. You know, I could do a full program on each war without struggling to find information. So I may well at some point do a series where, you know, I do 3 Monday or Thursday evenings in a row, or 4 on the biggies. But yeah, the big things to remember are, you know, the military generated records, but they don't always end up in one central place, which is good, because if they end up in one central place with a fire, that's not good. Generally, for genealogy work, yes, track down the actual service record of your ancestor's time in the Army, but it's really going to be draft and pension records that are likely to have the genealogical information. So if you're having trouble finding the actual service record, don't panic, because there's probably not going to be that much in it that you won't find elsewhere. I mean, it's really interesting, and I'm glad I have, you know, this great uncle's 17-page file, but at the same time, that's not where the genealogical information is going to be. You know, that John Waterman, who was the lieutenant in the U.S. colored troops, you know, it's his enlistment paper and his pension where I got the genealogical information. And then the service record was fascinating because, you know, it's the story of a, you know, it's kind of like some of the other stories you've seen of, you know, white men serving as the leadership for the colored troops. It's a fascinating look at American society, but it's not necessarily going to help me with my genealogy. Classified records. Yeah, the real issue is post-World War II, you're dealing with privacy laws, and I don't know the ins and outs of how far you can push it on some of it, and how much being a verified relative gets you. I haven't tried it myself. I've heard of people who have success getting what's left of, you know, what there is of a father's record, and I've heard of people who get nothing. And so I don't want to say one way or the other. I don't know the parameters. You know, I don't know whether the cases I've heard of have significant differences, or if it comes down to who opens the letter when you write to them, and how big a sob story you've managed to put in. You know, I don't know the parameters on that. I haven't dealt with it. On the draft, if they sign up, it varies. I've seen some who signed up who aren't in the draft, but I've also found a couple that I know they signed up, but I've also found, you know, I don't know for certain on the signed up versus draft for World War II. I've seen some of both. Yet on the no documents, again, it's worth seeing if there's a regimental or battalion or whatever the US is. Often there's a almost an alumni group for World War II era US forces by battalion or something. And if there is, it may be worth reaching out to them to ask about if how to get records, because they may know what survives and what doesn't for the regiment. But I know that they have that for World War II and for Vietnam, sort of alumni groups who will help with that sort of thing. Or so I've heard. I know people who are involved and have helped, and I know people who found one and gotten information from them. I have not done it myself. My father was a couple years too young for, about 3 years too young for World War II. And when Korea happened, he was a graduate student in science, so was exempt. And then by the time Vietnam came along, he was on the old side and was married with 2 kids and working as a scientist, which would have kept him out of the draft, even if, in most cases, because he was in a protected profession. So yeah, military records are a huge topic, but basically what I wanted to do with this is to show you the kinds of things you might see, and that it is worth wading through, figuring out where things are, because there may well be records. I don't know the extent to which the pardons were individual versus like a whole unit. I haven't looked into that. I'm sure there's information online because the Civil War is so still, you know, there are reenactors and such, and so there's still a lot of interest. But I don't know off the top of my head on the pardons. I know many of them were pardoned, but I think a lot of it was pretty mass done, and I don't know if it lists individual people or just those who served in a particular regiment. I don't know. I don't want to say more than that. If you take a look and can't find it, let me know and I will see what I can find for you. So, okay, at this point, I'm going to stop the recording.